The thing about smoke is that it tells the truth. It rises from wherever the fire burns hottest, curls around whatever stands in its way, and eventually, no matter how long it takes, it clears. Daniel Mercer had spent 34 years learning that lesson the hard way, and on a sweltering Saturday afternoon in his brother-in-law's backyard, surrounded by the smell of charcoal and the sound of people who had never once believed in him, he was about to teach it to everyone else. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start where all the best stories start, at the moment right before everything changed. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, which Daniel always thought was the most dishonest day of the week. Not quite the misery of Monday, not even close to the relief of Friday, just Tuesday pretending to be something it wasn't. Annual Hartley family barbecue, you're invited. Saturday 2 p.m, don't forget to bring something. His wife Priya had taped it to the refrigerator with a little sunflower magnet, and she'd looked at him over her shoulder while she did it, the way she always looked at him when something required his courage rather than his agreement. "We don't have to go," she said, "not for the first time." "We're going," Daniel said, "not for the first time." The Hartley family barbecue was a tradition that predated Daniel's existence in the family by roughly 3 decades. Priya's family had been hosting it since her parents were young, since the backyard of the Hartley home in Millbrook, Ohio was nothing but a patch of crabgrass and ambition. It had grown over the years, the backyard, the family, and the ambition, into something sprawling and well-manicured, the kind of gathering where folding tables sagged under the weight of potato salad and opinions nobody had asked for. Daniel had been attending this barbecue for 7 years. 7 years of paper plates and plastic cups. 7 years of Priya's Aunt Claudette asking if he'd figured out the career thing yet. 7 years of her brother Marcus holding, caught by the grill like a general surveying territory he'd won in a war nobody else remembered fighting. Marcus Hartley was everything Daniel was not, at least. That was the story the family told. He was loud where Daniel was quiet, brash where Daniel was measured, successful in ways that could be photographed and posted on social media, his real estate firm's logo printed on the back of a polo shirt he wore to every family event like a name badge at a conference. He drove a black Escalade, coached his son's little league team, and had once, at a Christmas dinner 3 years ago, referred to Daniel as Priya's project, within earshot of 4 family members and a neighbor's visiting cousin. Daniel had said nothing then. He had learned, over 34 years, that saying nothing was sometimes the loudest thing a person could do. The trick was knowing when to deploy it. They arrived at 2:17 p.m., which meant they were among the first, which meant there was nowhere to hide in a crowd yet. The Hartley backyard was already alive with the early arrival energy, Marcus at the grill, naturally, tongs in hand, the smoke rising around him like he'd hired it for the occasion. Priya's mother, Sandra, was arranging a table of side dishes with the precision of someone who believed the placement of the coleslaw was a moral issue. Aunt Claudette sat in a lawn chair in the corner, wearing a sun hat wide enough to provide shade for a small country, already holding a glass of sweet tea and scanning the yard with the particular vigilance of a woman who had appointed herself the family's official record keeper of disappointments. "Daniel," Marcus called out, spotting him immediately. He had a gift for that, for making your name sound like a diagnosis. The man himself, get over here. Daniel crossed the yard with the calm, unhurried stride of someone who had decided, before leaving home, that today would not cost him anything he wasn't willing to spend. Marcus, he shook the man's hand, firm, level eye contact. "You look good," Marcus said, in the tone people use when they actually mean you look the same, and the same is not a compliment. "Priya keeping you fed." "I manage," Daniel said. He moved on before Marcus could say anything else. That was another thing he'd learned. Conversations with people like Marcus were like rip currents. The trick wasn't to fight them. The trick was to swim sideways and let them exhaust themselves. The afternoon accumulated in the way these afternoons always did, slowly, warmly, with the low-grade hum of family dynamics operating just beneath the surface of perfectly pleasant small talk. Children ran through sprinklers. Someone's uncle burned 3 hot dogs and blamed the charcoal. Priya found her college friend Nina, who had married into the family 2 years ago, and they fell into the easy conversation of women who have kept each other's secrets. Daniel found a spot near the edge of the patio, a cold drink in his hand, and he watched. He was good at watching, he always had been. It was one of the things people misread about him, mistaking his stillness for emptiness, his quiet for defeat. They saw a man who didn't push, didn't posture, didn't perform, and they translated that into a man who had nothing to say. They were, as they would shortly discover, profoundly mistaken. It happened at 4:43 p.m. Daniel knew the time because he had just checked his phone, a message from his business partner, Ray, confirming the wire transfer had cleared. He'd smiled at that, tucked the phone back in his pocket, and reached for his drink. That was when Marcus materialized beside him. He didn't come alone. He never did. In his wake trailed two of his college friends, Derek and Phil, who had been attending this barbecue for the past 3 years as honorary members of the Hartley Extended Circle. They were the kind of men who laughed a half-second after Marcus laughed, who held their drinks at the same angle as Marcus held his, who had the comfortable ease of people who had decided long ago that proximity to the loudest man in the room was its own form of success. Also present, drifting closer with the calculated nonchalance of someone pretending not to be interested, Aunt Claudette, who had abandoned her lawn chair for the first time all afternoon. Sandra was nearby, fussing with the condiment table. 4 or 5 other family members orbited the scene, drawn by some ancient social instinct that tells people when a performance is about to begin. Priya was across the yard, she hadn't seen yet. Marcus stopped beside Daniel, looking out at the yard the way a man looks at something he owns. "Hey," he said, with the casual cruelty of someone who had been building to this all afternoon, "can I ask you something?" Daniel looked at him, sure. Marcus smiled, the wide, teeth-forward smile of a man who has rehearsed this. Derek and Phil drifted into position like backup dancers who didn't know they were in a performance. "What does it feel like?" Marcus said. He paused for effect. Let the yard go just slightly quieter. Aunt Claudette leaned in approximately 2 inches. "To be a failure." The word landed with the weight it was intended to carry. Failure. Not a question about a specific failing, not a reference to any particular setback or stumble. Just the word itself, dropped like a stone into still water, with the confident expectation that it would sink Daniel where he stood. The yard did not go silent, but it went careful, that particular register of a social gathering when everyone becomes acutely aware that something real is happening and they're not sure yet whether they should look or look away. Daniel felt Aunt Claudette's eyes. He felt Sandra pause with a spoon halfway to a bowl. He felt Derek and Phil adjusting their stances. He felt the cumulative weight of 7 years of this family's doubt concentrated into a single 8-word sentence. He looked at Marcus, and he did something that nobody expected. He smiled. Not a small smile, not a polite, pained, please don't do this smile, not the tight-lipped smile of a man swallowing humiliation. A real one. The slow, warm, untroubled smile of a man who has just been handed exactly what he was waiting for, and knows it. He held Marcus's gaze for a moment. 1 beat, 2 beats, 3, long enough that Marcus's smile began to falter at the edges, long enough that Derek glanced at Phil and Phil glanced at Derek, long enough that Aunt Claudette's head tilted very slightly to the right, the way it did when something was not going the way she expected. Then Daniel reached into his pocket. He took out his phone, he found what he was looking for, and he turned the screen to face Marcus. He didn't say a word. On the screen was a wire transfer confirmation, a number that had cleared that afternoon, $2.3 million, representing the completion of the acquisition of Daniel's software firm, ClearPath Analytics, by a mid-market private equity group out of Chicago, a deal 18 months in the making. A deal that Daniel had not mentioned to a single member of this family, not because he was hiding it, but because he had learned, very specifically, not to share things with people who had already decided who he was. He let Marcus read it. He watched Marcus's eyes move across the screen. He watched the exact moment, you could see it like a current switching, when Marcus understood what he was looking at. And still, Daniel said nothing. He just held the smile, patient, warm, utterly unrattled, the smile of a man who had been called a failure for long enough that the word had lost its teeth, worn smooth as sea glass by the sheer number of times it had washed over him without cutting. Marcus opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "Is that," he started. Daniel put the phone back in his pocket. He took a slow drink from his cup. He looked out at the yard where the children were still running, and the afternoon was still being golden and unhurried and beautiful. Then he looked back at Marcus, and with the quiet, unhurried voice of a man who has absolutely nothing to prove to anyone in this yard or any other yard, he said, "You asked what failure feels like." He nodded thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering the question on its merits. "I actually wouldn't know." He set his cup down on the nearby table. He excused himself. And he walked across the yard to where his wife was standing with her friend Nina, slipped his hand into hers, and leaned over to say something in her ear that made her laugh, really laugh, the kind that crinkles her eyes and tips her head back, and the two of them stood there in the afternoon light while behind them, Marcus Hartley stood with his tongs and his friends and his logo polo shirt, and the dawning, terrible awareness that he had swung at the wrong man on the wrong day. Here is what the Hartley family did not know about Daniel Mercer, because Daniel Mercer had never told them, because Daniel Mercer did not believe that the story of a person's worth should have to be defended to anyone who hadn't earned the right to hear it. They did not know that he had started ClearPath Analytics from a spare bedroom in their apartment 6 years ago, on a second-hand desk, with a laptop that took 4 minutes to boot and a business plan he had rewritten 11 times. They did not know that he had taken no salary for the first 2 years, that Priya had carried them financially during that stretch with the generosity and unflinching belief of a woman who saw something in him that the world hadn't named yet. That he had worked through weekends and holidays, and the barbecues he had attended wearing the face of a man untroubled by other people's opinions of him, because the alternative, letting those opinions take up residence in his head rent-free, was simply not something he was willing to do. They did not know about the investor who had pulled out at the last minute in year 3, taking $400,000 of committed capital with him, and leaving Daniel standing in a parking garage in downtown Columbus at 9 o'clock at night, staring at his phone, doing math that didn't work. They did not know what he had said to himself in that parking garage, the thing he had repeated like a low, steady drumbeat through every month after that, not yet, not done, not finished, until the math started working again, until the clients came, until the product worked the way he had always believed it would work, built quietly, carefully, without fanfare or performance or a logo on a polo shirt. They did not know about the morning 18 months ago when the email from the PE firm arrived, the first serious inquiry, and Daniel had read it 3 times, closed his laptop, gone for a long walk, and come home to tell Priya over coffee, speaking quietly, the way he spoke about everything that mattered. They did not know any of this. And in some ways, that was the whole point. The barbecue continued, as barbecues do. The chicken was served. The children ate too much watermelon. Aunt Claudette made her way back to her lawn chair, though she sat in it differently now, less like a judge, more like a woman privately revising a verdict she had been confident in for years. Marcus grilled, smiled, talked, did all the things Marcus did, but something had shifted in the molecular structure of the afternoon, the way a room changes when a window is opened. Nothing moved exactly, but the air was different, and everyone could feel it, even the ones who weren't quite sure what had caused it. Sandra found Daniel at the drinks table and filled his cup with lemonade without being asked. Priya tells me things have been going well, she said carefully, in the tone of a woman who was revising a file she'd kept for years, with the business. Very well, Daniel said, pleasant, no edges. You should have said something, she said, and there was in her voice the faint, complicated note of a woman who meant both I wish I had known and I'm sorry we didn't ask. Daniel looked at her with the gentle, unaccusing directness that was simply his nature. It wasn't a performance, it never had been, and said, I figured we'd get here eventually. Sandra nodded, said nothing else, moved away with the careful steps of someone carrying something fragile. Derek found a reason to compliment Daniel's watch. Phil asked, with studied casualness, what kind of company ClearPath Analytics was, exactly, as if he was simply curious and not desperately recalibrating everything he'd assumed for 3 summers running. Daniel answered both of them with the same easy, gracious, unguarded warmth he gave everyone, not because he was performing magnanimity, but because the truth was, and this was the thing people who confused quietness for weakness never quite understood, he had never needed any of them to feel good about himself. Their opinions of him had always been, in the most fundamental sense, none of his business. Marcus, to his credit, found him just before sunset. The yard had thinned, children were being loaded into minivans. The long Ohio evening was painting the sky in shades of copper and rose, and the grill had gone cold, and Marcus crossed the grass with the tongs still in his hand, an artifact of the afternoon, a prop he hadn't put down, and he stood in front of Daniel with an expression that was the closest thing to honest Daniel had ever seen on his face. That was, Marcus started, and then stopped and then tried again. I shouldn't have said what I said. Daniel looked at him for a moment. No, he agreed, you shouldn't have. I didn't know. That's the thing about people, Marcus, Daniel said, in the same voice he used for everything, unhurried, unweighted, perfectly level. There's usually a lot you don't know. He wasn't cruel about it, he wasn't triumphant, he wasn't anything other than simply, plainly, honest, the way he was about everything. Marcus nodded, looked down, looked back up, extended his hand. Daniel shook it. And that was that. They drove home as the last of the light left the sky, Priya's hand on the center console, the radio playing something low and unhurried. You knew all day, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even really a question. It was just Priya doing what Priya did, reading him with the accuracy of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time. I knew all day, he confirmed. And you just, she laughed, the real one, the one that crinkled her eyes, you just smiled at him. The information was going to be the same, Daniel said, whether I said it loud or let him read it quiet. Priya was quiet for a mile or two. Then, most people would have made a speech. Most people need the speech, Daniel said, because they need the other person to know they've won. He watched the highway lights come on one by one as the dark arrived. I don't need Marcus Hartley to know anything. I know what I built. Ray knows what we built, He glanced at her. That's plenty. She squeezed his hand on the console. Outside, Ohio spread out in the quiet, particular darkness of a Saturday evening after a long day, and somewhere behind them, in a Millbrook backyard, the last folding table was being collapsed and carried inside, the last paper plate thrown away, the last cup rinsed. And in a black Escalade pulling out of the driveway a few minutes after they did, Marcus Hartley drove home with his tongs on the passenger seat, and a thought he couldn't quite shake, the thought of a man who had built something real and quiet and lasting while everyone around him was busy deciding he hadn't. The thought of a smile that had answered every question without saying a single word. The thought that maybe, in all the years of noise, he had been fundamentally confused about which one of them was winning.